After 1600, the Atlantic slave system developed and grew extremely fast. It developed geographically, and it developed economically, and it drew in huge numbers of enslaved Africans forced across the Atlantic into this system. What we're going to do now is look at some important dates in that story and think about some of the major features of the Atlantic slave system in this period. How did it expand, and when? And what were some of its defining characteristics? A good place to start is by thinking about Brazil. For most of the time that we're interested in, Brazil was a Portuguese colony. And it's a region that often gets neglected or forgotten when we think about the Atlantic slave system. There's a tendency for us to focus certainly on North American slavery, and also perhaps on slavery in the Caribbean, and not realise that the largest number of enslaved Africans forced across the Atlantic, in fact, went to Brazil. 5.5 million of the Africans who were forced to embark European slave ships to cross the Atlantic in the whole period of the slave trade were destined for Brazil. That means that Brazil accounts for almost half of the whole of the slave trade. It's a place that has a slave economy for an incredibly long period of time. This begins in the 16th century, and sugar is a really important mainstay of the Brazilian slave economy all the way through. There are other sorts of economic activities as well, including mining, and by the 19th century, coffee is also really important in the plantation economy of Brazil, a plantation economy drawing in large numbers of slaves. And slavery is not abolished in Brazil until the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s. So we have here a place that for a long period of time has slaves working in its economy and is trafficking slaves across the Atlantic. So Brazil is really important, but most of our focus is going to be on the Caribbean and on the United States. Now, the Caribbean draws in almost as many enslaved Africans as Brazil. There are 5.3 million people, children, women and men, forced aboard slave ships destined for the Caribbean. Many of them destined for English or British colonies in the region, 3.8 million people embarking on ships destined for those places, or the French colonies, nearly 2.5 million destined for French colonies. The most important French colony in the Caribbean, indeed the most important sugar colony in the world in the 18th century, is Saint-Domingue. The French, though, also had other sugar colonies in the Caribbean, including Martinique and Guadeloupe. And there are also other European powers with colonies in the Caribbean, and many of them, most of them, including plantations run by slave labour. So, for example, the Spanish have the colony of Cuba, which in the 19th century became a really important sugar exporter. And there are other European powers too, with colonies in this region. Our main focus is going to be on the British Caribbean, often referred to as the Anglophone Caribbean, in other words, the English-speaking Caribbean. And you'll notice there that I've made a distinction between English and British. That's for the reason that in 1707, the Act of Union brings England and Scotland together to form Britain. So in the period before 1707, we should really talk about the English Caribbean as opposed to the British Caribbean. And the English arrive in this region during the 17th century, and the most important of the English colonies in the Caribbean is Barbados, which is settled during the 1620s, with the English first making landfall on that island in 1625. They also, in around the same period, settle on other islands in the Eastern Caribbean, the Leeward Islands, which include Antigua, Nevis and St Kitts. And it's in this region, particularly Barbados, in the 1640s, that a really important event takes place that defines the history of the Caribbean in the decades and centuries that follow, and that is the sugar revolution of the 1640s. Early English colonists to Barbados had experimented with a number of crops, including cotton. They'd also tried tobacco, and in the 1640s, learning from the ways in which the crop had been grown in Portuguese and Dutch Brazil, they realised that they can really effectively grow sugar in Barbados, which completely transforms everything on the island. Its geography and its social structure and its economy and almost every other aspect of life beyond. So that by around 1700, the beginning of the 18th century, Barbados is essentially one big sugar factory. It's an island about the size of the Isle of Wight, and by 1700 sugar plantations had taken over almost every single acre of land that could be cultivated for that crop, producing huge fortunes, going back across the Atlantic to satisfy a growing English sweet tooth for sugar, and drawing in huge numbers of enslaved Africans to that colony from across the Atlantic. So a really important transformative event. Barbados is the hub of the English Empire in the 17th century, the jewel in the crown, if you like. But it passes that status on to Jamaica by the 18th century. Jamaica had been conquered by the English from Spain in 1655, and you can see from the map that it's a much bigger place than Barbados. Sitting further to the west in the Caribbean there, underneath Cuba and to the west of modern-day Haiti. Jamaica, partly because of its size, meant that many more sugar plantations could be created there, and by the middle of the 18th century, it's Jamaica that is the beating heart of the British imperial economy. An island so valuable to the British that they can't afford to lose it, either in the American War of Independence or in the later wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Sugar, by 1740, coming in from these British West Indian islands, grown by slaves, had become the single most valuable import into Britain. So we have then, in the 17th and 18th century, the rise of these British colonies in the Caribbean centred around sugar and slavery. It's later on in the 19th century that the British decide first to abolish the slave trade in 1807 and then slavery itself in the 1830s. And the slave population of the British Caribbean at emancipation is about 700,000 people, which, when you consider the vast numbers of enslaved people who had been transported into the region, is a staggeringly low figure. And what that demonstrates is just how terrible slavery had been in the British Caribbean. Extremely tough on people physically and in all sorts of other ways, meaning that deaths by far outnumber births. And despite the large numbers of people arriving, there isn't a rapid expansion of the slave population. In fact, the opposite. The system depends on the slave trade to keep going. The situation was a bit different in North America. Fewer than 500,000 enslaved people embarked from mainland North America from Africa on the slave trade. So actually, in terms of the volume of the slave trade, North America accounts for just a relatively small portion of that trade compared to the Caribbean and Brazil. But by the time of emancipation, the slave population of the United States was about 4 million. Now, that's not to say that slavery in the United States was somehow a benign institution. Far from it. It was extremely brutal. But enslaved people there were able to reproduce for births there to outnumber deaths in a way that didn't occur earlier on in the Caribbean. So to think about the timeline of slavery in North America, one of the most important dates is 1607. This is the moment where the English established their first permanent colony on the North American mainland at Jamestown, in a region that later becomes known as the Chesapeake, the colonies of Virginia and Maryland, with their primary plantation export crop of tobacco. That region becomes really important to the colonial British mainland colonies, to the point that by the American Revolution, some of the most powerful and wealthy men in the land were Virginia tobacco farmers, like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, or James Madison. But actually some of the biggest fortunes in colonial North America were made further south, in South Carolina and then later on in Georgia, where it was rice plantations with really large numbers of enslaved Africans working on them that made very, very big fortunes for the South Carolina elite in particular, and the emerging elite further south in Georgia. American independence means that British North America became the United States. And the history of slavery in the United States until the 1860s is by and large one of expansion. There is a cotton revolution in the United States from the 1790s onwards, partly because of the invention of the cotton gin, which allows for the rapid expansion of cotton plantations across the American South. There's also the purchase of Louisiana from Napoleon in 1803, which opens up another frontier for plantation production in the Deep South. There are some sugar plantations in Louisiana in the early 19th century, but by the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s, it's cotton that is king across the American South, making huge fortunes, especially for planter elites in the Mississippi Valley. That period before the Civil War is often referred to as the antebellum period, and the Civil War in the 1860s fought in large part over the issue of slavery and its future, sees a victory for the North against the South, and that brings about the ending of slavery in the United States. So we have emancipation there taking place during the 1860s. So that gives you at least some sense of the chronology that we're working with. It gives you some sense of the ways in which this Atlantic slave system expanded, the importance of Brazil, the rapid expansion of sugar and slavery in the Caribbean after the 1640s, and the central importance of sugar and slavery to the British Atlantic Empire during the 18th century. We've looked also at the rise of slavery in the region that was to become the United States, with tobacco in the Chesapeake, rice in South Carolina and Georgia, and then this rapid expansion across the US South of cotton production in the first half of the 19th century.